everyone for coming this morning. I feel really lucky to be part of this series during a time where I think most of us are feeling a little bit stressed, and life's been a little bit more insecure for most of us. Maybe we're feeling a little bit lonely. I think these mornings are a great idea to come together and to talk about storytelling and creative things. I'm talking today about bushfire, and I think we can't talk about nature and climate and the environment in 2020 without talking about the climate emergency. So my book, A Constant Hum, was published last year. Short stories about the aftermath of the Black Saturday bushfires, of which many of you will remember what you were that day of those fires. For those of you at home having a coffee or and have a look at this beautiful picture of our front deck from this is where I grew up. And you can still see that 11 years on after the fires of Black Saturday, although it's a very beautiful environment, you can still see the scars on the landscape. So those trees were raised and they're still standing, which is a really good, you can take lessons of resilience, but they're still struggling time after the fact. As Jeremy mentioned before, I think we can't really talk about the environment, nature, climate, so many things in this country without acknowledging the Orangery people. We have to acknowledge the tens of thousands of years that Aboriginal people have cared for the land and the ongoing damage that colonisation continues to cause. And I also wanted to say too, a lot of people lived through fires of Black Saturday. So, Black Summer, they get confused, similar names, very creative names, Black Saturday and Black Summer. So if you're feeling like a little bit raw about that, there are a few images that might make you feel a little vulnerable. So maybe tune out now. This is a picture of our house in 2009. So this was about a week after the fires of Black Saturday. And I was 22 that weekend, young enough to still turn to my parents for comfort, and luckily my parents were still alive, but old enough to kind of really want to make sense of what was being called Victoria's apocalypse, hell on earth. It was a moment where we came back to the ridge and saw all of the colours and all of the birds disappeared. And I think storytelling in that sense has helped me make sense of something that has very much not made sense. When you kind of come back to your home and everything that you know as it once was has disappeared, all of those normal anchor points of who you are and maybe your possessions and your sentimental kind of photos, you're kind of left with this white noise of what it means to live in this country, what it means to be okay. And I think I really wanted to use art, storytelling, and my creative practice, I guess, to explore that further, because I think when these big events happen, we really shouldn't be turning away, because they will only continue to happen, as I'm probably preaching to the choir, but with climate change, it's something that we really need to keep in the forefront of our minds. And I think art, particularly stories, can help that happen. So this is the my book. It's my first book, and the creative process behind putting it together took about 10 years. So I think it's really important when we're talking about creative processes too, that it doesn't have to happen overnight. I think I always had these goals that I would get it published before I was 28 or 30, and you lose sight of what you're really doing. I think our culture too very much wants us to produce, and I think the beauty of stuff like social media means that you can just trickle stuff through, you can work on stuff, you can test the waters, I guess, a little bit. And I think that probably most people online today would be aware that, Instagram, Twitter, so many different social media platforms are bringing stories to us from all parts of the world as what we're doing today. When I was telling my story of Black Saturday and the bushfires of 2009, I found it really comforting to think about the smaller details of nature, of the environment, because I think too, we get very busy and we don't realize that it's the small things that kind of keep us going and give us perspective. Um, yeah, I think I wrote a piece recently for the NGV magazine, and it was about tech and especially during COVID-19, how we do have time if we're lucky enough to take notice. And whether it's, the magpies in your backyard, if you live in Brunswick, whether it's, your herb garden or the dusty gravel of your road if you live more rurally. I think I'm a really big believer that it's the small details in the natural world that can kind of bring you back to the present. And I think it's really important to recognize those in a changing world as well, so we don't lose sight of what is important. I'm not sure if this will play. But this is our house, our rebuilt house in Christmas Hills. So many of you, when you think about Black Saturday, will think about King Lake. So King Lake's not so far away. Um, and, and for me, it's been really surreal to kind of see things from this level and to kind of think about how the smaller pieces of who we are as people and the natural environment make something bigger. I'm going to skip forward, actually. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to skip forward to another slide. This image, I think, was circulated quite broadly after Black Summer. And as you can see, is huge. And I think that with COVID-19 and with the news landscape changing, there are a lot of people who were underneath that smoke during the summer, and I think it's really important to tell. So I'll read my story. Maps was one that I found myself going back to Google to kind of like what we're doing today. You look for connection online, and I went back to look at Google Maps. Mind you, this was in 2009, so a fair while ago, but I found myself returning often to the page to see the satellite image that hadn't been updated of our house that had burned down. So this is an example of storytelling that's quite short and to the point. Some people call it flash fiction. I know that short stories have given me a great deal of comfort throughout my life, and whether it's through music, whether it's through sculpture, art, even just community storytelling, I think that's where you can learn a lot, feel less grief, and feel less loneliness. So this one's called Maps. It takes the satellites a while to catch up. Our place on Google Earth is still there months after. Every morning, I reload the page, and there's something calming when I still see no blackened scar through green. And I think that too emphasizes for me our connection to land is often much more entwined than we think. And I think there's a book out at the moment by Jenny Odell, which is How to Do Nothing. And she speaks a lot about how, it's really important to take notice of the natural world. What's the point of building an online world when the world around us is crumbling? And I think about that a lot. And I think it's through taking notice we can change that. One of my favorite writers is Aileen Miles, and I'm sure many people have heard of her. I wanted to read this quote this morning because I think it's a really good one to start our days with. When I'm not feeling 100%, I return to this quote because I think it really summarizes um, what we're all here for. Um, Aileen writes, I hope you find yourself sleeping with someone you love. Maybe not all of the time, but a lot of the time. The touch of a foot in the night is sincere. I hope you like your work. I hope there's mystery and poetry in your life. Not even poems, but patterns. I hope you can see them. Often these patterns will wake you up and you will know that you're alive again and again. For me, patterns in my work too are incredibly important. I broke up my book into 3 parts, into wind patterns. So that links back into taking notice, into um, um, bushfire again. So A Constant Hum tracks the 10 years after Black Saturday. So it starts with prevailing winds, which is the calmer, more everyday winds. So it's like the everyday aftermath of bushfire. 10 years on, people are still struggling with, some people are still struggling with insurance claims, survivor guilt, all of these different complex things. Southerly, the middle section of the book, deals with the 3 to 5 of bushfire, which again can be to do with, of course, grief of people who've lost families and landscapes. And then the first part, the last part of my book builds up to northerly, which many people in Melbourne will associate with very hot winds and visceral winds. So it kind of climaxes at the fire. I think when we're thinking about creative projects, me, I always thought if I was going to write a book, I didn't think I'd have the diligence, the patience, the stamina. And by breaking it down into smaller parts really meant that I could focus not only on the stories, the individual stories, and then also the stages. So I think for any writers out there, any budding writers, any established writers, I think we're all kind of trying to keep everything afloat in such a busy time and such a chaotic year. But I think it's Margaret Atwood who says word after word after word is power. So that's how I wrote A Constant Hum. And I think having that connection and linking it back into the patterns of the environment that I wrote it in was a really helpful thing. Um, I took this photo maybe a week after Black Saturday in 2009. This is my father. And I use this quote here: we are a landscape of all of that we have seen. And I think that's a really telling thing for many of us, and whether it's a city landscape, whether it's I think we often other the bush from and we live in landscapes, but we do, like the magpie example, it might be your mint in the background. It's all the small details that make us realize that we are maybe more vulnerable than we think we are, but there's hope and beauty in that as well. I don't think anyone can probably sum it up any better than Greta Thunberg. I think about this quote a lot, and I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. And I think we we went through those recent fires of Black Summer, and with the word of unprecedented and shocking and horror, and it was horrific and unprecedented, and this season was incredibly long. But we are very short-sighted in this country, and I think it's really important to remember that these events are continuing to happen. I use this quote from the 2009 Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission final report as an epigraph to my book. And it is: we have seen the pain people have endured and continue to bear, and we know it will be a long road to full recovery for many. But if time dims our memory, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. And again, I'm probably preaching to the choir because everyone at this session probably is very much on the same page, but I personally have to continually remind myself that of the direction that we are heading in. And I think obviously the young people who are out marching in the streets, they know it more than anyone, and that we have to continue to create art about nature and alongside good, strong policy and accountable politicians. A Constant Hum is 47 short stories, and I wrote the book very much in mind with my mother in mind. I think that there's a very white and male narrative around bushfire in this country, and I think it's to all of our detriment. I think that we often see images of the ashy-faced fireman, the man in thongs on on the roof of his house with a hose, and I think that the images of strength are really um, they're not as expansive as they should be. And for me, in A Constant Hum, I think storytelling really made me grieve less for the absence of the imagery of the strength of the women in my life, which I didn't see reflected back in me. The emotional labor, all of those different things that that women historically have had to do. But it's really important to highlight women's stories, as with stories of all people of all different backgrounds. On that note, here is my mum and I in our rebuilt house, and I think that the main thing to come from writing about landscape, writing about nature, about writing different people's experiences is that once you add many more threads to the national narrative of country, of bushfire, of all these different things, it means that more people have room to tell their stories. There is less loneliness, sadness, guilt, survivor's guilt, judgment. So I think that it's really important, the recent fires of Black Summer, to keep that in the forefront of your mind, and to remember that we live in a country that's very much affected by the changing climate, and we all have a responsibility, and our leaders have a responsibility, and hopefully talking about it as much as we can on mornings like this, where we're all coming together, prompts change. And I think I'm hopeful. But yeah, thank you again for having me this morning. I love the Creative Mornings community, and if you have any questions at all, yeah, that's where I am, and that's me. Thank you.